All right, thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Ken Capon with the Analyst's Office. It's great to see all of you again for this session. Today I'll be giving you an overview of the changes in Proposition 98 and commenting on some issues for you to consider. I think the administration did a nice job summarizing their proposal, so I'll just pull out the highlights. I won't go through all of that again.
Good sheet.
And we'll be speaking from a handout. I believe the sergeant passed that out a few minutes earlier. So turning to page 1 of our handout, as you know, Proposition 98, the minimum guarantee is determined by many different economic factors. And the minimum guarantee can change even after the end of the fiscal year. In 14-15, as the administration mentioned, the minimum guarantee is up $387 million. One of the interesting points about that is the state in that year is making the largest maintenance factor payment it has ever made. As you know, the state accumulates an obligation to schools in tighter fiscal times and must repay schools that maintenance factor obligation when state revenue is doing better. In 14-15, that total payment is $5.4 billion. Moving on to 15-16, the minimum guarantee is up $766 million. Also, as the administration mentioned, because of higher revenue in that year, the state makes a maintenance factor payment of $810 million. That completely retires the maintenance factor obligation that the state accumulated during the last recession. And it is actually the first time since 2005-06 that the state has ended the year with no maintenance factor on the books. Turning to page 2 of our handout, we summarize the allocation of Proposition 98 funds by segment. The guarantee in 2016-17, as you've noted, is $71.6 billion. The key factors driving the increase over the 15-16 level are growth in general fund revenue, as well as that supplemental payment, which is something the state makes to ensure that Proposition 98 funding grows at least as quickly as the rest of the state budget. The state, because it's not growing school funding as quickly as the growth in the state economy, also creates a new maintenance factor obligation, and that new obligation is $548 million. One point we think is worth noting has to do with the increase in local property tax revenue. This is a similar story to what you've heard in previous years, where increases in local revenue are covering a large portion of the increase in school funding. In 16-17, that primarily has to do with growth in assessed property values. As I think you've heard in the past, the state has experienced a very strong recovery in the housing market, and that drives local revenue up around $929 million. In addition, some revenue that the state shifted away from schools and community colleges in the early 2000s is shifting back in 16-17. That's associated with the final quarter of what we sometimes call the triple flip. And so because that revenue is shifting back to schools, there's less of a burden on the rest of the state general fund. Turning to page 3 of our handout, this covers some of the highlights of the administration's proposal. As was mentioned earlier, for K-12 schools, the largest augmentation is $2.8 billion to continue the implementation of the local control funding formula. The budget includes $300 million for the second year of the CTE grant program. And for community colleges, there's a series of proposals, including some funding for deferred maintenance, as well as 2% enrollment growth. On page 4, there's a more complete list of the new proposals that are occurring in 16-17. Happy to walk through those, but you'll be covering all of those in subsequent hearings. Turning to page 5, we give you some comments on our estimates of the guarantee. In the past, you may remember that we've had some different estimates than the administration, particularly with regard to general fund revenues, and that also affects our estimates of the guarantee. This year is a little bit different. We think the administration has offered a very solid starting point for this year's budget deliberations. Estimates of general fund revenue and the guarantee seem reasonable to us. We would note that by May, updated economic data will lead both the administration and our office to revise estimates of the guarantee and of revenue and of the guarantee. And the year in which those changes can occur can actually have much different implications for schools. In 14-15, the guarantee is highly sensitive to changes in state revenue, and any increase or decrease in state revenue would increase school funding or decrease it virtually dollar for dollar. A much different story unfolds in 15-16. The guarantee is relatively insensitive that year, such that changes in revenue would have very little effect on school funding. And finally, in 16-17, it's more of a middle-of-the-road story. Any increase or decrease in revenue in 16-17 would increase the guarantee by around 50 cents on the dollar that year. One area where we do have some differences with the administration has to do with estimates of local property tax revenue. Across the 2015-16 and 16-17 fiscal years, we think the administration's estimates of property tax revenue are around $1 billion too low. And those differences primarily are concentrated in two areas. The largest has to do with estimates of savings from the dissolution of redevelopment agencies. As you know, the state dissolved these agencies in 2011 and provided for a gradual shift of revenue back to schools as the debts incurred by those agencies are repaid. It's a difficult area to estimate. We've put together, I think, a model that accounts for the key factors in that. And we ended up around $700 million higher than the administration over the 2-year period. We also think that assessed property values are likely to grow somewhat more quickly than the administration estimates. Based on data from county assessors, we estimate growth of 6% in 15-16, and we think that will increase even further in 16-17. The administration has growth at 5.6% a year in both years, which is about average by historical standards, but we think a little bit too low based on improvements in the housing market. Turning to page 6, we think we would note that the administration dedicates about $520 million in ongoing funding to one-time activities. In the scope of a $72 billion budget plan, that's a relatively modest cushion against any sort of future decline in the guarantee. Having that $520 million devoted to one-time activities gives you a little bit of a buffer. If the guarantee declines in the future, you don't have to cut ongoing programs right away in order to accommodate a lower funding level. So the legislature could consider dedicating even more funding to one-time activities if you wanted a larger cushion. We've also heard many questions about how an extension of the Proposition 30 income taxes would affect school funding. And our estimates are that an extension would raise between $5 billion and $11 billion per year, a large range that really has to do with a lot of the uncertainty around the income of high-income earning Californians. We looked at various economic scenarios of what tests might be operative and what factors might be in play with Proposition 98 in the years that an extension takes in effect. And we found that in most of those scenarios, the minimum guarantee increased by around 50 cents on the dollar for each dollar generated by the extension. So if, for example, the extension generated an additional $8 billion per year, school funding might increase by around $4 billion per year on an ongoing basis. We also looked at the possibility of a deposit in the state school reserve. As you know, that's linked with some other limits on local district reserves. And we found that that seems relatively unlikely that a deposit would occur in the next few years. It requires some very specific conditions to be met, generally associated with a very large year-over-year surge in state revenue, and we don't see that occurring within the next few years. And lastly, turning to the final page of our handout, there's been a lot of attention recently focused on growing district costs for CalSTRS and CalPERS. A 2014 law is gradually ramping up district contributions to CalSTRS. In addition, the CalPERS retirement system has begun increasing its rates in order to move that system closer to full funding. In recent years, through 15-16, district costs have increased by around $800 million for those two systems combined. School funding has grown by around $10 billion. So initially, school funding is greatly outpacing those higher costs. It's a little bit of a different story if you look over a longer period of time. Over the 7-year period from 2013-14 to 2019-20, we anticipate school costs rising by around $5 billion, and that compares to anywhere between a quarter and half of the increase in the minimum guarantee over the period. So, depending on how the economy performs over the next few years, we anticipate school funding will, over the period, outpace growth in those costs, but it continues to be a very significant issue for many districts. the need to cover those higher costs, as well as to provide additional services for low-income students and English learners under the LCFF. So that covers our assessment, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I think we'll do questions at the very end. Department of Education.
Good morning, Deborah Brown with the Department of Education on behalf of State Superintendent Tom Torlakson. Really, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to have the superintendent speak with you this morning. And so I'll just defer my comments to what he spoke about in terms of our priorities for the short term, so for this year, and then for the long term. And so we do look forward to working with you and your staff and providing the support and expertise that our department can do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Just right there. I have a couple questions for you, and I know Mr. Ting did as well. I wanted to ask the Department of Finance about after-school funding, and do you think that this is potentially the year? I know that under Prop 49 it remained static as far as funding in the state. The first few years, certainly we had the recession, and so everybody took a haircut. In the last couple of years, we've seen some restorations, and didn't see in the proposal. Just wondered if you think there is merit to the arguments put out by people that basically run after-school programs, that costs have gone up. They're basically rationing access now, fixed costs, minimum wage costs, and so forth. So wondered if Department of Finance had an opinion on that, and whether the funding was at the appropriate level or not.
Certainly. Chris Ferguson with the Department of Finance. So the governor's budget does not propose a change in the funding level for the after-school program. That said, we would note that because there is the Proposition 49 guarantee, during the recession, these programs did not see a reduction similar to other categorical programs or base revenue limits at the time. So at this point, we'll continue to monitor the funding for these programs, but we don't have a proposal to increase funding for that.
And what would you say to the programs that are basically reducing slots right now? They can't afford to continue to provide the access they were providing before.
So I think one of the core components of the ACES program is actually that there's a local contribution and a local match. And we would say that given the amount of flexible funding that districts are receiving through the LCFF, they can certainly support or enhance their support for the program based on their local decision to do so.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, but I know Mr. Ting has to go, so let him go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just more toward finance. I know that we are getting close to the full implementation of LCFF. I know one of the issues that the Assembly's been very concerned about is making sure that the money that's there for concentration supplemental is actually getting to the students. We know that we haven't seen eye to eye with the department or the governor's office in some of the ways that we've been trying to hold the districts more accountable. So I did want to ask, what are you all willing to do to ensure that the rubric that we set up is actually, the money is actually getting to those classrooms and to those students? Because at this point, our ideas of accountability haven't really been seeing eye to eye. So I would like to hear from you all. What are you all going to do about accountability?
So Ian Johnson, Department of Finance. I think that as the superintendent very eloquently sort of described in his testimony, this is a concern for all parties that are interested in education funding. And because of that, we've endeavored to create a very robust system, not only when it comes to reforming the way that we allocate funding to schools, but also in the accountability structure behind that funding. And so we only have part of that system up and running now. The LCAPs have been around for a couple of years. Districts are filling out their third year of LCAPs. And in that venue alone, we are seeing improvement because many school districts are continuing at this point conversations about the goals that they've established for their students and for how they're using their supplemental and concentration grant funding to increase services for English learners, low income, and foster youth. The first year that they were developing LCAPs, those conversations were happening in many districts for the first time. We've heard a lot of feedback from school districts that for the first time, academic and financial members of school districts are having robust conversations about how to best utilize their funding, again, for the first time. And so we're very encouraged from the feedback we receive so far. That's not to say that we don't hear these concerns and that we're not aware of them and that we're not concerned. There are other pieces of this accountability system, though, as the superintendent mentioned, that are still being developed. I don't know if I don't recall that the evaluation rubrics were mentioned by the superintendent, but that is something that we are very hopeful and very much believe will show districts a lot about the outcomes that they have historically had for their students, and it will inform how they make and establish sort of goals moving forward. And those evaluation rubrics are going to be adopted by the State Board of Education in 2016. And then obviously, as the superintendent mentioned, there's the collaborative, which is another big part of the accountability structure. That collaborative has an executive director that's been appointed, there's staff being brought on, and so school districts are going to start to be referred to this collaborative for support. And so it's not a simple question to answer because this is a very robust accountability structure that we're creating, but we think that in the middle of all of this that is being established around this issue, we think that it cuts against where we're going to stop midway and to change the rules on school districts when we've been signaling very clearly for 2 or 3 years now where we're expecting them to go.
So I think it's fine that we have anecdotal information. I think what we had been trying to get at was something that was more system-wide. I know that we had efforts that we had worked out with the superintendent's office that were in the budget bills that got taken out. In particular, every district right now reports in the LCAP what they believe they're getting in terms of concentration in supplemental money. The superintendent's office was willing to post on a website that information by district. It's already public, but it's buried in the LCAP so that nobody in the public could find it unless they are, let's say, have somebody who, as a paid forensic analyst. So I do want to know for the record why the governor's office opposed that and took that out of the budget.
So I think that,
because to me that was something that was very simple accountability that the assembly was asking for. We were able to get it into conference and it got taken out at the last minute.
So I think simply put, creating a new state-centric reporting requirement on school districts when we are in the midst of all that we're implementing with the new accountability system was something that we felt like was counter to where the state is headed when it comes to local control and accountability.
But it wasn't new. So it's something that's already reported right now. We wanted to shine a light on it. It's already on the web. If somebody had the time, like if someone had, 10 analysts, they could go get the information. The superintendents was willing, so there was no additional reporting from school districts. What it was shining a light on bureaucracy. So I want to know for the record why it was opposed by finance. It's not true. It was not any new requirement for the schools.
What I'm referring to when I say a new requirement is it is a new requirement on school districts to have to report that information to the superintendent of public instruction through a new reporting data point. And
no, it was not. That's not accurate. That's completely inaccurate to say that. So what it was is there's a part in the there's an item in the LCAP where they report this. The superintendent was willing to, at a de minimis cost, put that information on a separate website. Why was that objectionable for finance?
So again, I would point to the fact that that requirement cuts directly against where we are headed currently when it comes to the accountability structure and the new paradigm of local control with some basic accountability requirements that are still being developed, and then systems of support for school districts. So that's the rationale that I can provide for you at this time. Where
are we headed then? So we're headed toward hiding information that's in LCAPs? Because that's what that act was about hiding information that's in the LCAP that we approved, the board approved. It was highlighting a specific piece of information in the LCAP. So I'd like to know why that information was so precious that we couldn't share it with the public.
Well, I think it's important to remember that we're in a transition right now when it comes to LCFF. And through that transition, districts are having to do a lot to adapt to the new paradigm under LCFF.
This has nothing to do with districts. This is simply to do with hiding state information. The districts report this information. The districts report this to the state superintendent. What I want to know is why we can't share this piece of information with the public.
So school districts are calculating on their local control and accountability plan per the spending regulations how much of the funding that they're receiving under LCFF is attributable to supplemental and concentration grant funding.
Correct.
And that's something that goes on the LCAP.
Correct.
And then from there, school districts are determining by how much they must increase services for English learners, low income, and foster youth. It's not that every single school district is currently reporting this to the superintendent and that there is some sort of an order that funding, that information not be released to the public. It's that the data is in the over 1,000 LCAPs that come from school districts, and then the over 1,000 LCAPs that come from charter schools. And so it's out there for locals to see. We've already established through the testimony in this committee that LCAPs are, they're posted on county office websites and school district websites. But to add a new piece to the accountability transition that we are in, where during this transition, school districts have to report to the superintendent something that they weren't having to report before.
You are absolutely erroneous about that. This information is in the LCAP, right? Is this not in the LCAP?
That information is in the LCAP.
And the LCAP is put out to the public. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was the objection with taking that number? So again, no additional district reporting, putting that number onto a website so that it would be easier for the public to find that information. Why was that objectionable?
Again, as I've mentioned several times, it cuts against where we're headed when it comes to the accountability structure.
So where are we headed
for the state?
Because this is it's like a mystery novel. I'm waiting for the end.
So we're 3 years into the transition to LCFF, and as I testified and as the superintendent testified, there are several components of the new accountability structure that are being developed. Once the LCFF is fully implemented and every single district is at their target, it's going to be very simple to be able to see how much funding is going out in the form of supplemental and concentration grant funding. But we're in a transition now, and so what we're dependent on is school districts' local control and accountability plans and the state board spending regulations.
Mr. Ting, I have a suggestion. First of all, this is an issue that we spent 20 minutes with Mr. Torlakson on. Many of my assembly colleagues have talked about this, but both sides of the aisle, making sure that we have accountability and oversight and know what's going on in our local districts. And obviously this issue is important. We put in our budget last year. Didn't get finalized. It's still one that we care about today. I want to ask the LAO and maybe Department of Ed, when we have our LCFF hearing in a couple weeks, to come back and maybe talk about this issue and what options we can have to focus on what Mr. Ting is talking about, because I don't think it's an unreasonable request for public information. The answer you were going back and forth with, I doesn't think getting at. I think it was a separate thing you were focusing on than the overall transparency of the public dollars that we're looking at. And so, hoping that we can maybe regroup on this issue and come up with a solution that works. But really want to see if maybe LAO next hearing could provide some insight on this as well.
Thank you. We'll take that back and hopefully be able to come back to you at the subsequent hearing.
Okay. That work? Mr. Chavez?
Watching the fun.
Okay. I forgot where I was at here. Where was my three questions, 3 points? I remember the other one. Maybe the third one will come to me. I wanted to go back to Department of Finance and the early ed proposal. I know that's kind of a. Who should I look at? You or you? Yeah. A big question. There's a conference across the street. They're trying to figure out. There's many more questions than answers, and we're going to have a discussion on this in a few weeks. And so I guess kind of the big picture thing is that you noted that you're having an internal stakeholder process, and you hope to have some clarity on what it is by the May revision. And I guess if we just said, okay, we hear that and we support it, and it seems that that's kind of a truncated process. And just comparing it to LCFF, where you had a couple years of dialogue and stakeholders and trying to figure out what it means to current providers, to the TK programs and families that are currently there, to the issues that Mr. Torlakson raised as far as the money that was taken out in the last 7 years and not currently being held today, to the issues of quality and standards. So, do you think that that's enough time, or I wonder why the administration isn't proposing like putting a bill out, going through the legislative process, or doing a process like you had with LCFF, where you had kind of a larger dialogue on something so complex and important as getting it right for our youngest learners in California.
Certainly. So we do believe that we can put together a reasonable structure by the May revision, but within that we also acknowledge that there will need to be a transition within this program from the existing programs to this new early education block grant. So we've recognized that. I think what we're looking at is getting that structure in place in the upcoming year. And we believe that we'll be able to do that through the stakeholder process, receiving feedback from stakeholders and integrating that into a well-thought-out proposal. But your concern is duly noted, and we understand that it is a rather tight time frame, but we believe it is accomplishable.
Okay. Do you have no. Mr. Chavez? Okay, thank you. That finishes this panel, and we will be back. We have a few months to go into these issues in greater detail. Today was just the overview. Yes, and then before we finish today, we have our third piece, and that is public comment from anybody who wishes to talk about the Prop 98 2016-17 budget. So what do you think?
Mr. Chairman, members,
Let me see. Okay, we're going to ask every presenter to try to make your comments to 90 seconds or less.
Very good. Terry Burns, the California School Boards Association. I'm here with Martha Alvarez from Access, part of the Education Coalition. And we know that you have our letter in this regard. In general, we think the budget is very positive this year. We're very encouraged. We do want to remind you of our key principle, which is to protect the integrity of Proposition 98. Continuing to add new programs, in particularly unfunded programs, just further dilutes the funding that is available to our schools. So that becomes a significant question for us every year. We are supportive of the funding going the bulk of the funding being placed on the local control funding formula. School districts are getting the rhythm of this now and finding different ways that work in their community to educate their children best. We are concerned about the continued funding of mandates, federally funded mandated programs that are out there. We know one of the programs that's suggested here is to backfill the charter schools funding that was cut from the federal budget. We note that there are a number of places that there are mandated federal programs that are not backfilled. I would suggest to you special ed, therefore, and some of the nutrition programs that we're expected to do but aren't fully funded. So as long as you're funding federal shortfalls, those would be good places to start.
And three other issues are regarding school facilities. We believe that Prop 98 should not be used for paying for school facilities. We believe it should be paid with general obligation bonds. There's a current state and local matching program that has been going on for many years. So we would oppose any efforts to pay Prop 98 for facilities. Regarding the ECE block grant, we applaud the governor for having a conversation about the investments in early learning programs and continuing that. However, we would like to see this through the policy committee process. We are concerned about the timing and having a very quick conversations over the next 3 months of the budget discussions. So we would encourage the legislature to have outside hearings to talk about the ECE block grant. We have questions and a lot of questions and concerns about quality, access, eligibility, and a number of other issues. And then lastly, we would urge the legislature to engage on the conversation about continuing the stability of public education funding with the Prop 30 extension in the horizon. We think it's important to just have a conversation about the stable funding for schools. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair McCarty, Assemblymember Chavez. I'm Patty Herrera on behalf of Early Edge California. I'd just like to echo the comments made by our partners in the Ed Coalition on the governor's early ed proposal, and I'd like to commend Superintendent Torlakson for highlighting for everybody just how persistent the need in California remains. We are very interested in having this conversation that the administration, we appreciate the administration has highlighted for us. We appreciate the administration's confidence about their ability to develop a coherent framework in the next few months. However, we don't share that confidence. We believe that this issue, this policy area, is of great magnitude and is rather complex, and that it deserves a much greater deliberation than we can possibly have in the next few months. And we look forward to coming to your specific hearing on this issue and coming back with greater detail. But we just wanted to thank the administration for bringing attention to this matter, but we urge that this conversation happen through a much more deliberative process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assemblymember Chavez. Jeff Vaca, representing the Riverside County Superintendent of Schools and School Districts in Riverside County. Would like to echo the comments of the previous speakers. This is a very largely positive budget for K-12 schools this year. We will offer some comments when you get to your hearings where you delve deeper into the details. Mr. Chairman, we greatly appreciate your comment recognizing the fact that even with the substantial investments in K-12 in recent years, we still are at a great disadvantage in comparison to many of the states, most of the states in the nation. And even though Assemblymember Ting has left, in response to his question, I think we would agree with Superintendent Torlakson that investments do make a difference with achievement, but also point to that graph on the last page of the legislative analysts' analysis that was provided to you today with regard to the increasing burden on K-12 districts for STIRS contributions, and that increasing amount will continue to erode the purchasing power, if you will, of the LCFF base grant, and that's just something to keep a close eye on moving forward. Additional investments may just keep us where we are today. And then finally, one comment with respect to accountability. Speaking on behalf of the Riverside County Office of Education, we take our role in terms of providing technical assistance to our school districts very seriously. And even though Our statutory role is to approve or not approve the LCAPs. We have been going much further than that in terms of working with our districts to ensure that the strategies that they are embarking on are consistent with improving student achievement and ensuring that the dollars get to the students who need them the most. Thank you very much.
Chairman McCarty, Assemblymember Chavez, thank you for the hearing and the opportunity to speak briefly. I'm here today, Michael Holsizer, on behalf of 47 school districts in Kern County. Because this is an overview hearing, we are not going to get into the details really of the governor's budget. I'm here really today on behalf of those 47 districts to make a few just brief reflections and comments about Proposition 98. You heard a great presentation this morning about the history of education funding over the last 7 or 8 years, particularly how we've come out of the recession. In the context of restoring funding to K-12 schools, we think this is a really good time to acknowledge just how effective and valuable Proposition 98 has been, not only for schools, but for the legislature. The elastic provisions in Prop 98, specifically the Test 3 provision and also the suspension provision, really allowed the legislature to make really necessary, difficult decisions. But those Test 3 and suspension provisions created, in the depth of the recession, almost an $11 billion IOU to schools. And we really want to thank the legislature, this committee, and the governor for restoring and eliminating that IOU, restoring that maintenance factor as you have done, and providing those funds back to K-12. In Kern County, we think our school districts have done an excellent job of honoring the commitment of the LCFF to restore funding, to enhance and improve services to children. They've done that. Clearly, Proposition 98 is no substitute for adequacy, but those discussions will happen at a later time. But we think this is a really good time to not only acknowledge the importance of Proposition 98 and thank the legislature and the governor for honoring it. Thanks.
Good morning, Sarah Lillis with EdVoice. First, we want to thank the committee for a really robust conversation. We think you're asking really important questions, which lead to looking at what is the state's role in oversight beyond just providing best practices. What is the state's role in providing oversight to ensure that we're meeting our constitutional obligation to offering every student an opportunity to learn? And I think I look forward to the LCFF conversation because as Assemblymember Ting has doggedly said, we need to look at what's the infrastructure required to both have transparency on the fiscal side, but also looking at what is the data infrastructure we need to have meaningful transparency on the outcome side. And I think that those are conversations that we look forward to having here. And we appreciate all of the members' questions to that point. And then we also just wanted to note our support of the governor's proposal in terms of backfilling on the loss in federal funds for startup costs for charters. We think that's a really important piece as well. Thank you.
Hello, Brad Strong, Children Now. Big picture, we're pleased that there are increases for education, and we get that there are some strategic advantage to underestimating projections and a more conservative approach. But we have two concerns on this front, and it impacts the way that funds are distributed once you settle up. So looking back to 14-15 and 15-16 settle up, we believe that any settle up funds that you distribute or that you decide to distribute across the board or to all school districts this year should be targeted to a weighted student formula, as would have been the case if they were included in the actual budgets of last year, not simply as an ADA. With respect to conservative estimates, we urge you to look more carefully at the estimated savings for Proposition 47 and adjust the projections upwards accordingly. I think there was the budget project, and the legislative analyst office did some good work on that. So if you just look more closely at those estimates. We also strongly support the administration's proposal to increase the academic and behavioral supports to the $30 million this year, and that's for the multi-tiered systems of support. And then with respect to early learning, while we appreciate the administration's interest in streamlining early ed funding streams and better aligning preschool, TK, and K-12, there are real implications and complexities of such a significant restructuring, and this just needs to be fully vetted in a more thorough conversation. And then one last point to that is very clear that no new funding was attached to the early learning proposal, and the early ed system has been hard hit in recent years, and even after recent restoration continues to face foundational challenges such as stagnant provider reimbursement rates, and a significant restructuring without additional funding could further destabilize the system. Thank you.
Good morning, Whitney Staniford on behalf of First Five California. We want to echo the previous comments and also the superintendent's comments that in a robust Prop 98 growth year, investments in our early learning system and in supporting the roles of schools in providing high quality early learning systems can no longer be postponed. We respectfully ask the subcommittee to add to the budget deliberation both significant one-time and ongoing investments in quality improvement, increased access, and increased per-child funding for our early learning system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Moira Top here on behalf of the California Charter Schools Association. We too add our names to the chorus of support for the budget. It's a robust, good budget that's getting us back on track. I wasn't planning on speaking, but because the startup grant has been mentioned a couple of times, I would be remiss if I didn't say that, of course, we wholeheartedly support the proposal. We think it's more than just a federal backfill of funds, and I know that you're going to have a full hearing on it in the future, and we look forward to that robust debate. Thank you.
Thank you again for participating, and this concludes our first sub 2 hearing. Adjourned.